Hello everyone, how are you? I'm Ari Thurger and today I'm going to talk about Diana, the goddess of the pagans. This is a Sunday video, so it's a special extra video which I intend to keep it short as much as possible, but I thought it would be a fitting subject for the videos I usually do or I usually submit during the month of October, which is always related to the mood of the season, witchcraft and witches. So, in this video today, I'm not going to talk about Diana as the goddess during the pre-Christian classical period, but rather speaking about her when she became generally known throughout Europe in the course of the Middle Ages, as well as the early modern period, became generally known as the goddess of the pagans. I'm going to explore the figure of Diana under Christian understanding, and the struggle of the Church to eradicate pagan belief systems and demonizing pagan figures, especially women. Diana in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period indeed became generally known as the goddess of the pagans, leading the night ride or the night flight phenomenon where witches were said to follow their goddess Diana, among other goddess-like figures who became variations of Diana by this time. And there is a peculiar focus on Diana as well as an evolution of this pagan goddess into the leader of the nighttime processions, the leader of the pagans and witches, and a great mixture of ideas which turned Diana into one of the most famous goddesses when it comes to the studies of witchcraft, to the point that in many neo-pagan religious movements throughout Europe, Diana is still very much worshipped to this day. So, on this video today, I will mainly try to analyze magic from the point of view of the clergy of the 10th century, according to the source called Canon Episcopi, which is a very important document, part of a canonical collection which was intended for the bishops of this period to understand that they had to do everything that was within their power to stop and uproot the creations and illusions of the devil. The cult of Diana, which apparently still bared some weight during the 10th century, was indeed a problem the clergy meant to deal with as fast as possible in order to eradicate lingering pagan beliefs. So the cult of Diana and the night ride phenomenon were seen as illusions of the devil. Therefore, the church had to deal with that at all costs. With the Canon Episcopi, there was a great change in the religious mentality that would influence everyone across Europe, especially in the shaping of the image of the witch. Following that, I will also try to analyze other elements present in the Canon Episcopi, such as the cult of Diana itself. So let's explore all of this, and I do hope you enjoy today's video. Please. In order to have a better perception of what the Canon Episcopi stood for and in relation to the cult of Diana, which was still apparently active in the 10th century to a certain extent, I'll put in here on the screen an excerpt so you might get a better notion. It is in relation to the belief in witches and women who practiced any sort of magic, which had been seduced by illusions created by the devil and led by the devil into doing such things. The cult of Diana was still active, as I said, to a certain extent, mostly held by women, but also men, and the church was certain that the goddess herself was not real, and the night ride of the witches was not real either, not in the physical sense, but in the sense of actually being an illusion created by the devil. Being a pagan deity leading women across the sky was simply a method used by the devil to lead people astray from the true faith and the one true Lord Jesus Christ. The church was sure that all of this existed, but not actually what the pagans thought to be true, or rather, what the church thought the pagans thought to be true, but were mere illusions created by the devil. So the clergy was now focusing on the idea that women believed in these things because they were being eluded and deceived by the devil. Any power and any notion of divinity that did not enter in the scope of the one true God of the Christians was seen as an illusion of the devil. There were no pagan deities, no pagan phenomenon and magic. All of it existed, but it was the work of the devil. This, of course, in the mentality of the church of the 10th century, right? The Canon Episcopi warned bishops that they must, and I quote, labor with all their strength to uproot thoroughly from their parishes the pernicious art of sorcery and malefice invented by the devil, which also included the pagan custom of the cult of Diana. Every pagan belief by this point onwards, especially the cult of Diana, which was still somewhat strong in some parts of Europe, was believed by the church that it was simply wrong and nothing more than illusions caused by the devil. It's the start of a total negation that pagan gods existed, and everything non-Christian was the devil's work, pure and simple. The Canon Episcopi is the official start of a war of the church against the devil. And everything that wasn't Christian or perceived to be Christian was surely the devil's illusions that had to be uprooted and eradicated. So in here, we start to have a bigger demonization of women, the shaping or the start of the shaping of the image of the diabolical flying witch, and the start of what would lead to the great witch trials later on. As from this moment onwards, many of the later documents concerning witchcraft and the basis of judgment in witch trials are all influenced by the views on the Canon Episcopi. Now, it is important to highlight the words that are used in the Canon Episcopi to describe Diana. She is called Domina, a goddess which women obey as a lady. Domina in the sense of being housewife, owner of property, the wife of the dominos, the lord, owner of a property, the chief, nobleman, which makes Domina a sovereign. So Diana here is seen as the sovereign of the pagans, and the women who ride with her through the skies in the nighttime processions. She's the lady of the pagans. Now, I'm not going to delve into the night ride or the night flight of the witches in this video, not today, but I'll leave that for a future video, this very month actually. But this is one of the major problems from the point of view of the medieval church. Not only do women ride with Diana, but they obey her as their mistress. And I'm using mistress in here in the archaic sense of the term as the opposite gender of master, right? So they obey her as their lady, Domina, when in fact they should, on the contrary, obey only the true Lord, Jesus Christ, the Dominos. And these women met secretly on specific nights to worship her, to worship Diana, etc. We are still far from the 15th century witch trials, of course, at this time, the 10th century. But now, for the first time, many elements of earlier notions of witchcraft have been brought together, consolidated and classified as heresy and diabolism. And here it starts the great religious change that would lead to the persecution of those who slightly showed any hints of a practice that wasn't related to the obedience to Jesus Christ, and then leading to the horrible suffering and death in the centuries that would follow. As you know, Diana is a goddess in classical Roman and the Hellenic religion. She was associated as the patron goddess of those who lived in the countryside, literally the pagans, not yet with its Christian connotations, but still the classical meaning of paganos, those who lived in the countryside. So she was their goddess because she was the goddess of the hunt, of the wilds, of the wilderness, and she progressively gained other associations, such as the goddess of the moon and the goddess of crossroads. And crossroads here in the sense of being the paths of the dead and ritualistic and magical performances. In this sense, Diana was equated, to a certain extent, with the Hellenic goddesses Artemis and Hecate. So Diana too became a goddess of magic, of those who lived in the countryside, the pagans, those who lived in the Pagose, which is the area outside of a city, literally the countryside as being the realm outside the city. This is the original meaning for pagan in the pre-Christian classical Roman world. And this makes all the difference because Diana in pagan times was already associated with the pagans, with the people outside the city, which gives us indications that her cult wasn't particularly a religion of the state. It did not first enter in the religious panorama of the state, but rather a cult of those outside the religious scope of the Roman state. So the origins of Diana as a goddess had already been associated with the people that did not belong to the civilized and sophisticated panorama of the cities. Therefore, she wasn't originally included in the official pantheon of deities worshipped within the official religion of the state. Which is why her cult has always been quite different and associated with magic, which was seen as a practical cultic manifestation of faith that did not belong in the official religious expressions of faith, including practical ones of the state, but rather to practices completely apart from the main religious views. Which is why she was also the goddess of the crossroads. Not the goddess of the city, not the goddess of the temple or anything within the city, but the goddess of the crossroads, the paths outside the city, the world outside the city, which in the Roman pagan mind, their lives in the physical world were divided into two sides, the sacred and the profane. The sacred was inside the walls of the city, within the civilized world, within the controlled and orderly world where the temples were built. And the profane was outside the walls of the city, the wilds, the chaos, the inconsistent and the disorganized. So Diana belonged to the deities of the profane world. She was understood like that already in the pre-Christian classical period, and she continued to be regarded as such with the advent of Christianity. Because the religious changes and the official religions start in the great urban centers, in the cities, within the places of political, military, and economic power. And as such, the countryside is often neglected, often forgotten, and change tends to take its time to settle in the remote areas. So it's only natural that the cult of Diana was still quite active even until the 10th century. And even though a great part of Europe was already Christian, and those who weren't have already been introduced to Christianity and even adopted certain Christian religious ideas and conceptions and incorporated them into their pagan religious practices. Now, as I was saying, the Roman world was literally divided into two sides. In the formation of a new settlement, the territory would be divided into two sides by the agrimensore or the grammatici, which was the person that would make that physical division, the parceling of the territory. And the division was the pars destra, or the right side, and the pars sinistra, the left side. This was a highly religious act, using a plow to delimit the city limits. This line opened up with the plow was called vallum. The space within the limits was called the pomerium, the symbolic border of a Roman urban center. The interior was considered the place of the gods, hence the constructions of the temples to the most prominent gods within the city limits, and the place of the official religion. It was the civilized space. The exterior, on the other hand, was considered profane, the place of mysteries, the unknown, the wild, the uncivilized, hence the construction of the necropolis, for instance, outside the city limits, for practical reasons, of course, to avoid health issues, but also religious purposes as well. The place of the dead and the underworld, the dwelling places of the ancestors. And Diana was the goddess of the profane, the goddess of the left side of the city, the outside of the city, the pars sinistra. That's precisely where the word sinister comes from. Diana was the goddess of those living within the profane side, the profane realm, the pagans. This is important to understand her origins and why her cult remained strong even after Christianization, because she was the goddess of those in the remote areas, away from the religious centers in the Roman provinces. Of course, we have a long religious evolution behind the figure of Diana, from the goddess of the wilderness to the goddess of the hunt. And then, of course, Diana became the aspect of the triple goddess at some point. Into the cult of Diana, it was also incorporated aspects of the goddesses Luna and Hecate. And it is here that she also becomes associated with the moon and magic and with the underworld. Her cult considerably grew and she became a beloved goddess, to the point until she became associated with childbirth even. She incorporates a more maternal aspect, and we see in here precisely the need of the state to incorporate a goddess whose cult was growing fast, the need to also maintain the general population of the countryside, of the rural areas, under control and to receive their political, military and religious support. Indeed, the cult of Diana took huge proportions, so her cult was eventually pushed or brought into the centers of power. So it's small wonder that even after the fall of the Roman Empire, her cult was still strong throughout the former Roman provinces. In the early Middle Ages, mostly of Western Europe, such as the countries that would become eventually Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, Germany, and also even the British Isles, her cult was still quite strong, and in fact there are references to the goddess Diana during the early Middle Ages, the 5th century to be more precise. However, they are sporadic, but it's there, often in religious Christian sermons against the pagans. But then we start to have a problem. Christianity was, well, and still is, a patriarchal religious manifestation, based on several other patriarchal religious manifestations, mainly Hebrew, Hellenic, and Roman. And such patriarchal systems of belief had already constructed a very denigrating image of women, mainly those who held cults, religious practices, magical performances, and even the worship of goddesses. All of those were all expressions of faith outside the religions of the state, the religions of the patriarchal system. So a forced attempt to create a very negative image of women and goddesses alike was created to diminish such religious manifestations in favor of the patriarchal religions of the state, of the patriarchal rulership. So Diana, in the early Middle Ages, progressively became associated with nighttime creatures, beast-like feminine demons, biblical and non-biblical feminine figures, which had previously already with a great negative image in the past, and such negative image of women was perpetuated by the church precisely to extinguish the great cult of Diana and other pagan beliefs, which were in direct conflict with Christianity. But also using Diana as a general reference to lingering pagan beliefs across Europe. We shall get to that further ahead, don't worry. So, Diana in the Middle Ages became associated with Lilith of the Hebrews, Herodias of the biblical scriptures, Lamia, Circe, Medea, and many others of the classical world. All feminine figures distorted by the patriarchal societies of the past to diminish the power of matriarchal systems of belief in direct conflict with the patriarchal religions of the state. So it's in the early Middle Ages that we first start to hear about Diana riding across the sky in a night procession, taking with her diabolical magical women, recalling the previous magical women who were pictured as sorceresses, evil witches that could fly, equating Diana with the blood-sucking and baby-snatching feminine figures of pagan mythology and folklore, to provoke fear in the hearts of the populace. So that's when we start to have that idea expressed in the Canon Episcopi about women riding the skies across the world with their goddess Diana, the goddess of the pagans, the diabolical witch. The figure of Diana as the goddess of the pagans and the leader of the night ride greatly influenced other peoples across Europe during the Middle Ages, as far as Iceland actually. For instance, Diana begins to be associated with Holda and vice versa. Both goddesses incorporate each other's characteristics in the Middle Ages. Holda, as you know, would be a northern Germanic fertility goddess and leader of the wild horseback riding. The famous horseback riding referred to as wild hunt or wild chase, even before Odin became a prominent god and also eventually became associated with the wild hunt itself, which was originally taken by a feminine goddess. From the beginning of the 11th century onwards, we have many German references about Holda and Diana as being the goddesses of the pagans. With Holda and or with Diana, witches were believed to fly with them and participate in demonic combat. And all of these accounts frequently quote the Canon Episcopi, precisely. Eventually, the tradition of the night ride reached Iceland even before the end of the 13th century, and we have a couple of sagas speaking precisely about witch rides in Scandinavia, where, unsurprisingly, such Scandinavian accounts bear a remarkable amount of continental European religious influences concerning precisely the witch rides. When we read many of the Old Norse accounts and Icelandic sagas, especially those from the 10th and the 11th century onwards, there's much continental European Christian influence in them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I shall explain this in more detail in the near future on the video about the night ride of the witches. Stay tuned. Anyway, it is also at this time that Herodias is added to the name of Diana. Herodias, in turn, is part of the Christian tradition. I have a video precisely about that, talking about Herodias as another figure added to the medieval image of the witch. Once again, incorporating several female figures who had already been demonized and forming a single figure as the religious element in direct opposition with the church, which in turn was associated with the figure of the devil, as in diabolical wicked women in league with the devil, and being misguided by the devil under the illusion of a goddess figure. In addition to Herodias, Diana was also related to Hecate. As the goddess of the moon and lover of the night, Diana was also, in one of her aspects, identified with Hecate, goddess of magic and the underworld. And it was characteristic, actually, of Hecate that she rode at night, followed by a troop of women, or rather, souls disguised as women. The presence of these variants indicates that similar traditions, or perceived as such, were detected at different times and places. This could confirm the spread of these beliefs. However, the question remains as to whether bishops, as well as the later inquisitors, actually forced these beliefs they fought against into pre-established elements. For example, the reference to Diana as the goddess of the pagans immediately suggests the presence of an early Christian Roman deformed interpretation derived from the ancient religion. Thus, it is not known whether the various associations of divinities with Diana really deal with somewhat similar traditions that were later grouped together, or whether it is an attempt by clergymen to group these traditions in predetermined ways, a kind of Roman interpretation. This would later on lead to a lot of mistakes from the part of Neo-pagan religious manifestations of the 19th and 20th centuries, assuming Diana was a major European goddess from an archaic tradition of the mother goddess figure. The assumption that there was once a great mother goddess. Now, this doesn't take away the fact that indeed in the past there were mother goddesses, but there were also war goddesses, solar goddesses, earth goddesses, goddesses of magic, goddesses of every possible thing. The problem is that the early neo-pagan religious manifestations in the late 19th century and along the 20th century focused too much on interpretations by the clergy in relation to Diana, which led to the assumption of a major unique goddess of the pagans, in an attempt to fight against the male god of the Christians, which wasn't the case at all in the actual pagan past. So many modern neo-pagan assumptions rely too much on the written Christian interpretations rather than archaeological evidences. And this is perfectly evident around the first half of the 20th century, with feminist movements against the patriarchal system. Many neo-pagan feminist movements that would later give rise eventually to the neo-pagan religious manifestation called Wicca pick the figure of Diana as their goddess fighting against the patriarchal god of the church. Pretty clever. But that generated misconceptions in relation to the pagan past, as was said before. Although there may be an interpretation by the clergy, it would be incorrect to say that there was a real cult to these goddesses which had been associated with demons in the Middle Ages. cults among the peoples of the Middle Ages. I mean in reference to Herodias, for instance, and Hecate, and Holda, and even Diana during the Middle Ages. But certainly Diana seems to have remained quite strong among the various peoples of the rural areas across Europe. Of course, especially those within the former provinces of the Roman Empire. But it is important to reflect on this. The Christian interpretation of the Middle Ages did not actually suggest that pagans recognized the true identity of their gods and persisted in worshipping them despite this knowledge. Nor is there any implication of this interpretation that there was any kind of reciprocal pact between the devil and his supporters. Thus, horseback riding with Diana is part of a broad tradition that associated Diana with diverse deities during the Middle Ages, and even during the early modern age. The Canon Episcopi links Diana to paganism and therefore to demons. What I'm saying here is that Diana was once a very important goddess of the people living in the remote areas, in the rural areas, in the countryside, away from the centers of political and religious power. Diana was indeed a Roman deity, specially associated with the night and with wild nature and above all with wild animals. She was also associated, of course, with women and magic. And we know for a certainty that in pagan times across the Roman Empire, in rural areas, that women who practiced magic, any sort of magic, those who would be labeled witches, indeed prayed to Diana. So it makes perfect sense why Diana, in the Middle Ages, was the chosen pagan figure by the clergy as a form of scapegoat to identify lingering pagan beliefs, and why she continued to be associated with witchcraft and witches, because she had been the goddess of women and magic, and why all of a sudden she rides across the sky with witches riding on beasts, because she was once associated with wild animals, when in fact there is indeed no classical myth of Diana that portrays her as taking away human followers in cavalcades across the sky. Christianity starts in Rome. Christianity was a political construction within the Roman Empire to throw down the state from within and implement a new order. And then Christianity progressively spreads throughout the former empire. So the lingering goddess of the pagans the early Roman Christians were familiar with was Diana. With the Canon Episcopi and later documents that followed, and greatly based on the Canon Episcopi, we have all over Europe references to Diana as the goddess of the pagans, the general goddess of the pagans. And she becomes associated with other goddesses as well, and other feminine figures, which leads us to nowadays wrongly believe that the cult of Diana had spread all over Europe in the Middle Ages. But the fact is that the clergy used Diana as the name to speak of every goddess and every pagan worship and every magical performance they came in contact with during the Middle Ages and also early modern period throughout Europe. Whatever the remaining pagans across Europe in the Middle Ages were worshipping, whatever they called their gods during this period, the Middle Ages, it would not have been connected to the cult of Diana and their goddess if indeed they were still worshipping a goddess in the Middle Ages, did not certainly go by the Roman name of Diana. So this idea of Diana being the goddess of the pagans in the Middle Ages seems in fact to be a Christian interpretation of the classical Roman model, and transporting this interpretation to different local traditions, associating such traditions to their preconceived model and their notions of the cult of Diana, which is why it seems that Diana and her cult was widely spread across Europe. But this was simply the church identifying witchcraft and associating it with a figure, with a scapegoat, Diana, which in turn was understood to be an illusion of the devil. To the point that by the first half of the 16th century, all across the British Isles, we have church accounts speaking of Diana as the goddess of the fairies. Since the Canon Episcopi, every other document on witchcraft would always drink from the same waters of the Canon Episcopi and always point out to Diana, even if it had nothing to do with Diana. In the 16th century, Diana is all of a sudden the goddess of the fairies, having fairies following her. And this is a repetition of the 10th century Canon Episcopi and the condemnation of Diana and her spirits as a demonic delusion, and people who still held any sort of practice towards fairies, it was seen as following the demonic creatures of Diana, which by herself was an illusion of the devil. In the 16th century, some women across the British Isles, but mainly in Scotland and certain parts of Ireland and Wales as well, were said to have dealings with the fairy kingdom. So the clergy would automatically assume they were following the goddess of the pagans, Diana, which was the main tool of the devil to deceive women. As said before, the Canon Episcopi does not establish horseback riding with Diana as factual, but points out that these events supposedly occurred in a dream and were therefore the devil's illusions. Even though the rides took place only in dreams, there was still the need for punishment. However, the punishments for individuals who dreamt of Diana were not severe yet. But of course, with this being said, Diana was never actually the major goddess of the pagans, at least not believed as such by the actual pagans themselves of the Middle Ages, but rather believed to be the goddess of the pagans by the church, which led to pretty wrong assumptions within neo-pagan movements that would eventually sprout later on. In the 20th century, there is actually a reinterpretation of the legendary rituals associated with Diana. And there is this belief that there was a strong link between the goddess Diana to forbidden gatherings of women with spirits. Such is the fabrication of Aradia, claiming that she represented an authentic tradition from an underground witch cult which had secretly worshipped Diana since ancient times. But this, of course, has been dismissed by most scholars of folklore, religion, and medieval history. But there are still those who cling to it, of course, obviously. I mean, this is the entire foundation of the early beliefs within Wicca, the modern neo-pagan religious manifestation, and this absolute focus on a goddess, the goddess, as the leader of witches and the repressed pagan women. I mean, there's nothing wrong in believing in that and embracing such modern ideas, or indeed having a religion in which the entire focus is a single unspecified goddess figure or many goddesses into a single feminine aspect, just like the Christian interpretation on the figure of Diana precisely. And there's also nothing wrong in using that to affirm women's rights and fight against an oppressive patriarchal system. The only real problem is taking such assumptions as the historical truth of the pagan past, as if in pagan times it was indeed like that, which it wasn't. This great focus on a major goddess figure comes from the Church's notions of Diana being the goddess of the pagans, the general goddess of the pagans, creating a very individual and unique interpretation based on a Roman model and applying it to every sort of activity deemed to be witchcraft, and therefore those who practiced it were surely linked to the goddess Diana, which, in the views of the Church, was the goddess of the pagans, as a tool of the devil to ensnare women and lead them to sin and lead them astray from the right faith. Indeed, it's true, the actual first verifiable worship of Diana in our contemporary time began with Wicca. The earliest known practitioners of neo-pagan witchcraft were members of a tradition created by Gerald Gardner, which were heavily focused on the worship of Aradia, the supposed daughter of Diana, a made-up character from the American folklorist Charles Godfrey Leland, who published his work on Aradia in 1899 and gave rise to a new religious movement focused on that. Some later Wiccans would replace Aradia with Diana, her mother, as the central focus of worship. Diana within Wicca was eventually recognized as an aspect of the single great goddess, which in itself is a belief adapted from Leland's work. So you see how far the assumptions in modern neo-pagan religious manifestations go. Already from wrong assumptions from the Middle Ages. But it's not just within Wicca, obviously. No one can escape this. Many other modern religious manifestations have plenty of wrong notions and assumptions, such as Ausotru of the 70s up until the 90s of the past century, which drank from the same waters as Wicca, and not only constructed a false pagan past to fit into Wiccan religious ideas, but also greatly based on Romanticism and political ideas of the late 19th century and first half of the 20th century. So it's obviously very, very hard to present the historical truth when people have been believing for so long in something else entirely. Those who refuse to accept the truth will always be against those who speak it. But this doesn't take away the importance of the goddess Diana, obviously. She was an important Roman deity. But one thing is the pre-Christian classical Roman Diana, another thing is the Diana of the Middle Ages, which is precisely on the latter that many neo-pagan religious manifestations have focused on, instead of focusing on the real pagan Diana. So, many neo-pagans to this day worship the constructed image of Diana by the Church of the medieval period and early modern period as well, instead of the actual pagan Diana. But of course, obviously, there are still those neo-pagans who worship the pagan Diana, especially those in the countries that were once part of the Roman Empire, Roman provinces. And indeed, originally, in pre-Christian classical Rome, Diana was already the goddess of those of the countryside, the goddess of the profane, the goddess of the rural area, the wilderness, the goddess of the Pagos, which is the area outside of a city, the countryside. Therefore, the goddess of those living in the Pagos, the Pagani, the pagans, which is precisely why the early Christians picked Diana as the goddess of the pagans, because in pre-Christian Roman classical period, she was already the goddess of the pagans, the goddess of the people outside the centers of power, the goddess of the wilderness, and the profane of the pars sinistra, of the realm outside the orderly world of the official pantheon and the official religions of the state. In this way, indeed, Diana is the goddess of the pagans. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this Sunday special video. In the mood of the season, October, witches and witchcraft all over the place. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag.